But I've got to do it. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I've got some images which hopefully will stimulate some interest. And I'm going to talk probably for 45 minutes. Is what I'm. We agreed with the questions at the end, so I hope it's not too long, or I hope it's enough. And yes, the book came out a couple of years ago now, but The Making of England, published by Amberley, still in hardback. Some nice colour photographs in there. And my background, to be honest, is Anglo-Norman and late medieval, and I've become something of a passionate interest in the Anglo-Saxon era, which I'm going to be talking about tonight. So Jean told us a little about the fantastic church, Anglo-Norman 1150. I'm going to be taking us back to the 850s, the 950s. So we're going to go deep into what used to be called Anglo-Saxon England, but may indeed not be called Anglo-Saxon for much longer. Perhaps I'll call it early medieval England instead. But that's something we could come back to at the end of the talk, if you like. So I'm going to start in the year 927. 927. King Aethelstan of Wessex and Mercia conquered the Scandinavian kingdom of the Northumbrians, centred in York, and at a meeting on the 12th of July at Emont Bridge near Penrith on the Cumberland-Westmoreland border, which were the frontiers of the kingdoms of Strathclyde and what becomes England, he confirmed a peace with pledges and oaths with the chief non-English kings ruling Britain, having previously received the submission of the English king of northern Northumbria based in Bamborough. So these kings included Hywel, king of the West Welsh, Constantine, king of the Scots, Owain, king of Gwent. But also, soon after that submission at Emont Bridge, Athelstan's court poet, named Peter, wrote to the Queen Mother and announced Athelstan's creation of England, saying that he now rules with this England made whole. Next slide, please, Bob. Aethelstan called himself Rex Totius Britanniae, king of all of Britain, the kings of the Scots, the Cumbrians, North and South Welsh, the Archbishop of York, Northumbrian bishops all witnessed his charters. His coins asserted grand styles such as Rex Anclorum, king of the English, and Rex Totius Albionis, king of the whole of Britain. The new kingdom that Aethelstan proclaimed in 927 was to become the 1,000-year Reich, which is headed by his collateral descendants today in 2026. However, it came under immediate threat when a Celtic alliance of the kings of the Scots, the Strathclyde Welsh, Picts, King of Dublin, the Viking leaders from Ireland, the Western Isles, and the Northumbrians all got together their intention to restore the kingdom of Northumbria and York and create a buffer zone between the Scots of the South English. They met Aethelstan in a battle at a place called Brunanburg, which is somewhere on the Yorkshire Mercian borders. We don't quite sure where it is. No one's really identified it. Michael Wood thinks it's somewhere off the A1, just outside Doncaster. In 937, so 10 years after his proclamation of the Kingdom of England, this was perhaps the greatest battle that the English had ever experienced since they first came to Britain 400 years before. And it was remembered decades later as the Great War. Among the dead were two of Athelstan's cousins. The battle was recalled lavishly in a contemporary poem, The Battle of Brunanburg. Here, King Aethelstan, leader of warriors, ring-giver of men, and also his brother, the Atheling Edmund, struck lifelong glory and strife round Brunanburg, clove the shield wall, hacked the wall line with hammers' leavings. After the stunning victory over the Celtic alliance, Aethelstan made his theoretical claims become a reality. His grand designs reached well beyond England. He was an imperialist who looked to Europe for inspiration to model his kingship on, and he has been called an English Charlemagne. His half-sisters bound him in a web of continental marriage alliances. His nephew was a Carolingian French king, Louis IV, his brother-in-law, the German Emperor Otto I. The image you can see before you there, I'll refer to at the end of the talk, as well as dated to around about 930. It's the earliest portrait of an English king. Going back a little bit earlier to 924, Aethelstan has been chosen as king by the Mercians, where he's styled Rex Anclorum, king of Anglia. His half-brother, Aethelstan, was initially backed by Winchester in Wessex, but he died, conveniently, clearing the way for Aethelstan. So Aethelstan is crowned both king of the Angles and the Saxons at Kingston upon Thames, the boundary between the two old kingdoms, using a new coronation ordo that specifically referred to the two peoples, with the Archbishop Aethelhelm of Canterbury using a new regalia, a crown, a ring, a sword, and rod of office, in what was probably the very first coronation of an English king. Aethelstan is also the first king to appear crowned on coins too. However, the origins of how Aethelstan came to proclaim this kingdom of England 3 years after his coronation as King of Wessex and Mercia lie in the Viking conquest of the smaller English kingdoms in the 860s, starting with the Viking raids on Kent in the decades of the 790s, which prompted the Wessex Mercian hegemony. Aethelstan's coronation in 924 was that symbol of unification between two quite distinct regions, which had been kingdoms only a generation earlier. So to understand how England became to be, we must go back further than Aethelstan to his famous grandfather, King Alfred of Wessex. Alfred of Wessex is much more famous than Aethelstan. It's astonishing how few people seem to have ever heard of Aethelstan. I wouldn't hazard a guess or take a poll if I were with the students now. I'd ask you to be honest and vote in some kind of techno poll on Zoom. How many people have heard of Aethelstan compared with how many people have heard of Alfred? But I'd be willing to guess that the vast majority of you have heard of Alfred, and much more so than Aethelstan. So Alfred, of course, is Alfred the Great, named by later historians, of course. Why is he so famous? It isn't because Alfred was the first king of England, as is erroneously believed, but he was the last surviving king, the English king, during the Viking invasions. The Viking army had established themselves in York in 868, and then Thetford in Norfolk, 869, where Edmund, king of East Anglia, because Britain at the time was divided into these little kingdoms of Northumbria, Wessex, Mercia, Suffolk. There were some maps in a minute, don't worry. Edmund, king of East Anglia, was captured and brutally murdered. In 870, the Vikings were in Reading, and by 871, they'd overthrown those kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, which had been established over 250 years before. Without doubt, this is the greatest existential threat to the Christian English kingdoms since they'd been established in circa 600. With their law codes, trade networks, coinage, taxation, from Northumbria to Cornwall, Kent to Chester. There is no doubt that had the sole surviving Christian kingdom of Wessex been extinguished by the pagan raiders, our history would have been immeasurably different. So enter Alfred, England's darling, He had become king of the West Saxons in 871 in this darkest hour. After many battles, he made peace with the Vikings, in that he bought them off. There were more treaties in 876-7, and payments of tribute. The Vikings settled the area of the so-called five boroughs: Lincoln, Leicester, Nottingham, Stamford, Derby, and also land around Northampton, Bedford, and London. Slide 3, please, Bob. Excellent. So here's a map. You're thinking, thank goodness for that. It's from Wikipedia, I have to declare. Some of these sources are extremely academic and some are not so, but I've checked out the provenance and it will do. So you can see the Kingdom of Wessex here in the south, and that there's the last kingdom standing. And in the winter of 878, Christmas of 877, Alfred was celebrating the 12 days of Christmas in Chippenham. You can see it on the map here, the southwest. It's a royal estate, and he was almost captured by the Vikings. A cunning plan to sneak up and raid the Christians whilst they're having their, cold turkey and endless Christmas cake. He got away. Alfred escaped. It was a truce. It was 12 days of Christmas, which was a strict observance in Anglo-Saxon law. Every free man by law had to observe the 12 days. However, this was a very, very devious plan to capture Alfred. There was a full frontal assault on Chippenham, and then another Viking army landed in Devon, perhaps with that intention to take Alfred. But they failed. Alfred was certainly taken by surprise, not by the Vikings, and he fled into the Somerset marshes, which we can see, I suppose, on that map near Wilton, north of Wilton. If anybody is from that part of the world tonight, then please do speak up. He only had a small troop of men with him, and he fortified a tiny village called Athelney. And it's important to remember at that time the Somerset levels hadn't been drained, and we do get much more flooding these days. So, and of course, the Somerset levels do flood. If you ever see aerial photography or drone photographs of the floods, one imagines it would have been not unlike that all the time, as in Norfolk. So you've got places like Glastonbury, the kind of tors that were above ground. So he's taken refuge in a pretty good place, but it's not ideal. We're told by his biography, The Life of Alfred, which I'll come to in a few minutes again. It describes in great detail that King Alfred, with a small band of nobles and with certain soldiers and thanes, was leading a restless life in great distress amid the woody and marshy places of Somerset. He had nothing to live on except what he could forage by frequent raids, either secretly or even openly, from the Vikings, as well as from the Christians who had submitted to the Vikings' authority. So the brutal reality of this final invasion of Wessex was aimed at no less than the complete conquest of Wessex and the extermination of the last Christian kingdom. There's no inevitability about Alfred's survival. After the escape from Chippenham in 878, he was in desperate straits. However, in an astonishing turnaround 6 months later, May 878, he met with his army at Egbert Stone, east of Selwood, and defeated the Vikings in a great battle in his manor at Edington in Wiltshire. Again, you can see that on the map. Alfred then besieged Chippenham and forced the surrender. The Vikings gave hostages to Alfred. At this time, he gave none in return. 3 weeks later, Guthrum came to Alla, which was near Athelney, and Alfred, a true son of Rome, baptized rather than executed Guthrum, who then took the Christian name Aethelstan. So Guthrum was one of the most feared leaders of the Viking force, that particular army. However, at this point, let's just press pause on the narrative. It's very exciting. It's dramatic stuff. The band of brothers, we happy few. You can hear it resonating through time, can't you? Agincourt, Battle of Britain. Here we go. But the problem with Alfred's reign is that nearly all of the written sources originate with Alfred himself or his immediate entourage, including Bishop Asser, who wrote the life of Alfred, and indeed the famous so-called Anglo-Saxon chronicles. So if that desperate winter and spring of 878 was indeed a 1940 moment, Alfred anticipates by over 1,000 years the other great saviour of England, Winston Churchill, who was very fond of saying, "I shall leave it to history, but remember, I should be one of the historians." Churchill, as historian, of course, had access to the official secrets and confidential cabinet papers that no other historian had, putting him, just like Alfred, at the centre of not only the politics, but of the writing of the politics too. The Viking voice, by contrast, has no contemporary or even near contemporary written record. Sagas date for the 12th century, 400 years later. We are left with only the English sources. History, therefore, was quite literally written by the winners. The rewriting of history starts long before the raid on Chippenham in 878. The earliest Anglo-Saxon chronicle, the A text, was written a century after the first Viking raid at Lindisfarne in 793. But according to the chronicle, the first raid apparently happened in 789, when a group of Northmen landed on the south coast near a royal residence and killed the reeve in the harbour, which is named later on as Portland in Dorset. So the Wessex writers of this chronicle may have wanted to show that the first Viking raid was in Wessex, not in Northumbria. And at the time of writing, the 890s, the first chronicle was written then. Wessex, of course, is the only surviving early English kingdom. So the official history is creating a sense of inevitability around the fact that starting with the first raids in 789 to the victories of Alfred in 878. The A text was written at the end of the 9th century to about 891, the Old Minster, Winchester, which of course was the ancient capital seat of Wessex, and where Alfred was buried with numerous other pre-conquest monarchs. Not Aethelstan. I'll come back to him in a bit. There was another early text. The B text was written from about 977, but all the other versions of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles are written in the 11th and 12th centuries. Can we have slide 4, please, Bob? Asser's Life of Alfred, then, is the earliest known biography of an early English king, written in about 893, a good 15 years after the victory at Edington and the peace treaty at Wedmore. The story of the manuscript, this Life of Alfred, is itself instructive of how history is made as well as written. The surviving manuscript is dated to around about 1000 AD. It was saved by John Leland from the destruction during the Reformation 1530s, but was destroyed in the fire of 1731 in Ashburnham House, appropriately named in Westminster, hard by Westminster School, just before the British Museum was founded. But luckily, a facsimile had been made in 1722. Asser was a Welsh priest for St. David's, didn't meet Alfred till about 885, and so he's writing under the influence of Alfred himself. And he calls Alfred the king of the Anglo-Saxons all the way through. The Vikings are pagans, and the English are the heroic Christians, so he is perhaps setting out a holy war. And it's at the point of Alfred's desperate days at the Somerset Marshes that the legend of Alfred of the Cakes from the late 10th century life of St. Neot was interpolated by Archbishop Parker, who got hold of the manuscript of Asser's life sometime after Leland's death in the 1560s, and he thought that if Alfred hadn't burnt the cakes, then he jolly well ought to have done. So the myth reveals how desperate the situation for Alfred was, and how this was becoming a legend only a century later. And the story snowballs in the 12th and 13th century, and eventually becomes a fact. So was the situation in 878 as desperate as Asser makes out? Other evidence throws light on what was going on. The Viking raids on Kent in the 8th century enabled the Kingdom of Wessex to move in and assume control. However, there was a Wessex Mercian alliance right through into the mid-9th century. In 868, Alfred himself married a lady called Ethelwith, who was Mercian real descent, and the coinage again evidences this alliance. It's a charter of 875 given by King Ceolwulf of Mercia, and shows how he was the king of Mercia, and was in an alliance clearly with Alfred. Most famously in 2015, a metal detectorist named James Mather discovered the astonishing Watlington hoard at the Ashmolean Museum. This includes 13 examples of two rare emperor pennies, which show Alfred and Ceolwulf seated side by side, suggestive of another alliance between Wessex and Mercia, dated to about 878, at the very moment in time that Alfred and his band apparently stood alone. During the 870s, when Alfred was buying off the Vikings, the terms were not very favourable to Alfred, as the Chronicle does make out. We have a lease that survives made by the Bishop of Worcester in 872. And that reveals a far-reaching taxation to pay tribute to the Danes, saying it was a very pressing affliction, an immense tribute of the barbarians. It's clear from Asser and the Chronicle that Alfred had very few people with him in that spring of 878, but it might serve to emphasise his miraculous reversal of fortune, but it does reveal how little support he had. Indeed, the Battle of Edington was a bit of a local affair. All the inhabitants of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire did come along. Quite a few people didn't come along. Battles were a huge risk, often indecisive. Alfred had fought 8 in 1 year, losing several. He had no money to buy them off this time, so maybe he had to go into battle. It was the last resort. However, on this occasion, he did outnumber the Viking army and won a stunning victory. It can't be disputed that after the Battle of Edington, everything changed. In 879, the Vikings shared out land in East Anglia, the very last stage of settlement following Northumbria in 876. But Alfred's victory in 878 discouraged the Third Viking army from invading Wessex, and it sailed for the continent, where it remained until 892, settling in northern France and ending up being the Normans, which is another story altogether. The Treaty with Guthrum, made between 886 and 890, after the battle, was agreed and confirmed with oaths by King Alfred, King Guthrum, and the councillors of the English race, all the people in East Anglia. The borders were up from the Thames to the Lee to Bedford, and the River Ouse to Watling Street. Crucially, London was on the English side. Englishmen and Danes were worth the same with their guild, man price, 8 half marks of refined gold. Charles had Danish free men at 200 shillings, revealing something of an ethnic and social stratification. Next slide, please, Bob. So here is a map. This is taken from George Monet's Formation of the English Kingdom at the 10th century. His Oxford D. Fell thesis, published by Oxford University. A good map. Now, the really important thing about the division of England is that it's several things. First of all, it's the limit of Alfred's success. He'd reconquered and restored the Wessex Mercian hegemony, which goes back 100 years, including Kent and essentially, crucially, including London, which was the great uh, uh, trading city then as now. But it is not England as we know it today. These were the limits of Alfred's success. The Viking territory outside Alfred's control was in the so-called Danelaw. Now, the Danelaw is a term that does not appear until the 11th century. The Danelaw does not form any coherent political entity. Yes, we're not talking the Iron Curtain, where it was in the immortal words of Sellow and Yeatman, 1066 and all that, of course. All the right-hand part of England belonged to the Vikings. There were armies in the early 10th century associated with Northampton, East Anglia, Cambridge and Huntingdon, but they usually acted fairly autonomously. The 5 boroughs of Lincoln, Leicester, Nottingham, Stamford and Derby only later on constituted some sort of block, but it was not mentioned as such till the reign of Ethelred II, as late as 1013. Northampton, dear old Northampton, gets a mention in the Chronicles in 914, 917, but in 921 it's submitted to Alfred's son, Edward. So I think that's a key point, that Alfred's successes were remarkable, but they were restorative and limited in that sense. Indeed, really, his world, his kingdom was relatively small, 250 miles east-west and 50 miles north-south. He would have travelled his entire life from Cornwall to Kent, but he takes refuge in Athelney in 878, where he builds a fort and a monastery. And it may have been in Athelney in Somerset where the first chronicle was written. It's near Athelney that the famous Alfred Jewel was found. More about that in a minute. And it was at Alla near Athelney that Guthrum was baptized after the defeat at Edington and took the Christian name, Aethelstan, just to confuse you. That piece was completed at Wedmore in the heart of the Kingdom of Wessex and not too far away from the royal manor of Cheddar. 5 of the burgh fortresses, the Burgle Hydage, were in Somerset, more than any other county. So just a reminder that there was a very local feel to Alfred's life, the Wessex and particularly Somerset, Dorset, Hampshire. I think slide 6, I think. Thank you. Yes, we've got the Burgle Hydage. So, after this great victory in 878 and the following peace treaties with Guthrum, creating this not quite apartheid, but this kind of division, Alfred knew that he'd only bought time. He had not won the war. He'd won a battle. He had bought time. The rest of Britain was occupied and being settled by pagan Viking raiders who'd already declared their clear desire to extinguish the Christian kingdom entirely. So Alfred knew that he had to move on quickly from that. He, following the famous maxim from Vegetius, "He who desires peace, prepare for war," which quite possibly Alfred would have read that very book. In the years of peace between 878 and 892, he created a network of fortresses, a standing field army, and a navy, something that our current Prime Minister should take note of. The Burgle Hydage is a document dated to around about 914 in the reign of Alfred's son. And it gives us a list, literally a list of 33 fortified burgh towns. Some might be familiar to you: Cricklade, Malmesbury, a favourite place of mine, and the tiny little one there, Ling, where near to Athelney, where he took refuge, and some more familiar places. You'll notice, interestingly, that we're going right the way up to Warwick and Worcester, Buckingham. So we're pushing quite some way out of um, of Wessex, but that's because we've gone on to conquer the Mercia at some point. So these are fortified towns, and they're he's using Iron Age Roman fortifications. Sometimes it's Winchester, for example, Worcester. But some are entirely brand new, Saxon new builds. They're built with an internal grid. If you go to these places, Malmesbury, Cricklade, Winchester, you'll spot the sort of grid plan. At Winchester, it's astonishing that there were 5 miles of streets surfaced with 7,900 tons of cobblestones. Somebody's actually worked that out, it wasn't me. Designed for defence, but also for trade. Each burh assigns to 1 man per hide, 27,000 hides, which is a measurement of agricultural land. So Winchester and Wallingford have 2,400 hides, the biggest fortified towns, down to the tiniest one in Ling in the Somerset Levels, 100 hides, extending from Exeter to Southwark, Chichester to Buckingham. So to build and fortify and staff and man these towns, you need a system, you need taxation, you need organisation, you need authority, and all of that comes with it. This is done in that dozen or so years after the peace at Wedmore. Furthermore, Alfred is an intellectual, he's a scholar. In addition to these dozens of fortified towns and establishing military service, every free man had to do bridge work, burgh work, and army work. The Hera was the army, the Field. They had to do their military service. More than that, though, Alfred knew that he was fighting an enemy, the existential threat. He was fighting a pagan war. The way to win this war was to win with faith. And despite his localism in Wessex, Alfred was not a little Englander. His horizons reached Rome, and it was Rome more than anything else that underpinned his survival and the recovery from that great war of 871 to 8 with the pagan Vikings. Alfred had been to Rome himself twice before he was 8 years old. This is a unique experience. He was taken there by his father, the King of Wessex. He'd been blessed or hallowed by the Pope on his first visit in 853. And he thought in later in life that he therefore had a special calling because of that. On the second visit, he stayed for many months in Rome when he went again with his father Aethelwulf in 855. And on the return journey, stayed for months at a time at the court of the French king, Charles the Bond, grandson of Charlemagne. And in fact, Aethelwulf married Charles Bond's daughter, Judith, who was then Alfred's stepmother. And she had a great influence on Alfred's own learning and his court of scholars. When Alfred was king of Wessex in the 880s, he sent embassies to Rome, which was the capital of Christendom. And the Pope sent him a piece of the true cross, the most precious of relics. So in this tradition of early medieval English kingship, Alfred's family maintained those continental connections with the previous early medieval dynasties, intermarrying with the descendants of Charlemagne. And Alfred's retinue, his court scholars, were international. They were composed of French, Frisian, Scandinavian, Irish, Bretons. So this is his world, this is his mentality. He'd grown up steeped in this mentality of the great war of humanity, fighting, winning and losing battles with the heathen for much of his life. As those Viking raiders of the 790s became settlers and encroached further and further into Britain, taking out all those other kingdoms. So Alfred's faith and his contact with Rome particularly gave him not only the strength to survive 878, but to rebuild a new Wessex after 878, including his kingship and that of the English. So it's not surprising when Guthrum submits to him that he is baptized a Christian. And in that sense, Alfred knows that his faith is by far more powerful than the sword, because by converting Guthrum, he is assimilating him into Christendom. And indeed, Guthrum lives out his days in East Anglia quite peacefully. Alfred realized that the way to make this possible was by the pen. The pen was as mightier, if not mightier, than the sword. Alfred was a scholar. He learnt Latin. He taught himself Latin, and he knew that he could only mobilize his people by faith and also by their ethnicity. And to do this, he had to translate, in the first place, the greatest piece of writing at that time was Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English peoples. It's in Latin. Alfred had it translated into what we call Old English, and it's in this translation of Bede's History of the English People that the first use of the word Englaland first appears. England, Englaland. So already this is becoming an intellectual, mental flow of energy. Bede's original version is reduced down by a third. It's streamlined and it focuses on the arrival and the conversions of the early English. And of course, they go convert to Roman Christianity. And the translated version was widely copied and was designed to be read out loud. It was designed to be teaching. It was a pedagogical tool to assert English ethnicity and English nationalism onto the Bede originally had written it as an ecclesiastical history, of course. So the translate, sorry, slide 7. If we move on, possibly to slide 7, and there we are. This is just a nice image. This is from the earliest surviving copy of Bede's work. It's at the University of Cambridge. It's at Corpus Christi College, which seems to have just about an astonishing collection of medieval manuscripts. I think it's probably because the University of Cambridge doesn't have an old library like Oxford has at Bodleian. So at Corpus Christi Cambridge, you will find an astonishing collection of manuscripts, including the Moor Bede, which I think travelled to France and ended up in Spain and comes back to England eventually. Dates to 737. This is the original Bede, the ecclesiastical history of the English people. So Alfred has that translated, edited, and streamlined. It's not quite fake news, but it's certainly what the news he wants to give to his people. He sets up the Chronicles. The A text starts in 893. Asa writes his biography, so he's churning out a lot of this English literature. We also they make use of this word Engelkin, the English people, the English, they're promoting a racial superiority. The gens Anglorum, the English people. By contrast, the Vikings or the Vikinger are the contemporary word, just means raider or pirate. So they are kind of they're not given any status at all. They are pagans. They are pagani. They are seen as thieves, and theft is the worst of all crime in early medieval society. Be hanged for theft from the age of 10 upwards. in the law codes of Aethelstan. So Alfred is turning a war between Christianity and paganism into a war between the just war of the English and the other dark forces of evil. He also ordered that a copy of the translation of Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care be sent to every bishop in the kingdom. They'll have with them a bookmark we call an aethelstan, which is worth 50 mancuses, price of 300 sheep, 50 oxen, of great value. And it should not be taken from the book in the church unless it's with the bishop or on loan, or indeed if someone is copying it. And our next slide shows us one of the most famous artifacts from the reign of Alfred, the Alfred jewel. Found unbelievably in a field in the 17th century by a ploughman. No metal detectoring at that time, and it's now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's called an aethelstan, and it's the most astonishingly beautiful thing you'd ever see. If you ever do get a chance to go to the Ashmolean and see it on display, it's only about a couple of inches big. It's amazing. And on the side, it is inscribed, Alfred mich hecht gerichen. Alfred had me made. By direct order of the king, Alfred had me made. And you can see that image. Possibly that is Alfred himself. Possibly. It is the most beautiful object. There were quite a few aethelstan made. Quite a few have been found. This is by far the most beautiful. It's rock crystal, gold frame, gold engraved plate, sitting on a sheet gold dragon-like head. Now, the idea is that there's a short golden tube there in the dragon's mouth, and the idea is that is supposed to slot onto some kind of wooden stick, a pointer. Seven have so far been found. One in Oxfordshire, Dorset, Warminster, Warwickshire at Bidford, not far from me, and South Yorkshire. However, one has also been found in the far north of Norway, at a place called Borg on the Lofoten Islands. And it's known that a wealthy trader called Othir came to Alfred's court with walrus teeth and a walrus bane, and so possibly in exchange he picked himself up an aethelstan. So it's called an aethelstan from the Latin hastula, which means little spear. So it's probably they were pointers. So they were kind of bookmarks, and they were pointers. So the book, which is Gregory's Pastoral Care, Bede's English Ecclesiastical History, kept in the church or the parish chest, and this was ordered to be sent out to all of these bishops with the books. So there may well be others lying buried under English soil. In 890, Guthrum died, as they had been baptized Aethelstan, and he issues coins under that name, and he is possibly buried at the royal estate at Hadley in Suffolk. However, in 892, the Vikings return. They come back from the continent, this time meaning even more bad news. But this time, Alfred is ready. He's built his 33 defended towns. He's got a military service, national service kind of thing set up. But it's bad stuff. Campaigns rage across England and Wales, from Chester to Exeter, Essex, Kent, the Isle of Wight. Alfred's got his ships. He's built his ships. It's a bad situation, but it's not as desperate as 878. 899, though, Alfred dies during a brief cessation of conflict in this time, and he dies, and he's called king over all of the English race except that part which was under Danish control. His son Edward succeeded, but immediately his nephew, a rather disgruntled guy called Ethelwold, rebelled, occupied Wimborne Manor, and carried off a nun to Northumbria, as you do. and later on joined with the Viking force in East Anglia to attack Wessex. So it's business as usual in Anglo-Saxon England. However, having said that, I mentioned Edward, but the nephew Ethelwald conveniently dies in battle in 904, leaving Edward and indeed Alfred's daughter, Ethelfried, of course, who famously rules Mercia independently of Wessex until 918. Now, she's known as Lady of the Mercia. She's married to a powerful ealdorman, Ethelred, who's from London. He dies in 911, and she rules independently. She is her father's daughter, and she rebuilds and fortifies a dozen towns across Middle England. She leads campaigns against the Danish army bases. One Irish source referred to her as the Queen of the Saxons. And at the time of her death in 918, she was succeeded by her daughter, Aethwin. The only example where we know a daughter followed her mother, and who was actually recognised as such by the Mercian nobles. However, this brief Wessex Mercian divide after Alfred's death comes to an end when Uncle Edward, who's Alfred's son, King of Wessex, pushes aside Aethwen. He obviously can't deal with his sister. She's, a force to be reckoned with. But when Ethelfried dies in 918, Edward steps in, deposed his niece. The two regions have reunited, Wessex and Mercia. And at this point, Edward builds upon what his sister's been doing and pushes further north. It's not a reconquest, it's a conquest of what had been the Mercian Northumbrian kingdoms. And he brings them into the overlordship of the kingdom of Wessex. We also know that there's other ways of doing this, that they're encouraging their thanes to buy land in Danish territory. So there's a kind of commercial element to this conquest. Back to the Danelaw, which I did mention a bit earlier. It's not a contemporary phrase, Danelaw. It wasn't an iron curtain. By 911, the treaty that drawn up between Guthrum and Alfred had disintegrated, largely due to Ethelfried's campaigns. The treaty itself doesn't even mention the Mercians or Guthrum. And as I say, the term Danelaw doesn't appear till the 11th century. It's very misleading. So that kind of Viking hinterland, the soft underbelly of Mercia, the north, collapses very quickly. Ethelfried captures Leicester, Stamford, and Nottingham in 918. And one imagines that Northampton, I've not mentioned it much, but Northampton is kind of in the background. It's in the thick of all of this. It's under Danish occupation from the 70s and 80s. And now it's, liberated, if you like, conquered by the English Edward and his sister Ethelfried. And the latest research, the recent research shows that really the Viking settlement, the DNA settlement DNA analysis shows very low levels of occurrences. The highest Viking DNA, Danish DNA, I should say, is Orkney, 25%. And York is another hotspot. But really, when we're talking the East Midlands, we call it today the so-called five boroughs, and Northampton, the Danish kind of settlement and intermarriage was very, very limited. It only lasted a couple of those decades. So by 924, the death of Edward, Alfred's son, he built fortifications and territory way beyond Mercia, gone up to North Wales, Chester. He was recognised as the most powerful man in Britain. Much credit must be given to his sister Ethelfried, who built that foundation for him. So Edward is the man, Alfred's son, who takes the credit from that. As I say, it's not a reconquest, it's a conquest. It's a Wessex conquest of the long dead Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But the Viking invasion has created a vacuum, a power vacuum into which Wessex, the Kingdom of Wessex, steps. And so, back to where I started, Aethelstan is crowned king in 924. He follows Edward, he's Edward's son, and he's crowned the sole king at Kingston on Thames, king of Wessex and Mercia, using that new coronation format, crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury with a new regalia, rod, sword of office, and so on. And 3 years later, in 927, Aethelstan proclaims the new kingdom of England. So to conclude, this is far removed from Alfred's kingship, but very quickly achieved in the space of a generation. Alfred's kingship was deeply personal. Those heroic wars in 878, the Somerset Marshes, the Burrs, the conversion of Guthrum, the spread of literature has the personal stamp of Alfred himself all over it. His extreme piety, his Carolingian style of religious devotion, may actually be driven by chronic illness, possibly Crohn's disease. That symbolizes his heroic efforts to overcome this bodily sickness, the internal sickness, which perhaps represents that external pagan adversity. Asa talks a lot about that in great detail, of course, how the human body, the bodily ailments can reflect the outer political world outside. Alfred is no doubt the first king we can rightfully say changed and indeed wrote history, but his limits are quite well defined. Survival and restoration were his watchwords. His achievements were germinal, perhaps rather than complete. In 1935, the French historian Henri Pirenne completed his masterpiece, Mohammed and Charlemagne, finally published in 1954. Pirenne's much criticised thesis was that the advance of Islam has caused a break with antiquity. The pagan Viking invasions of England after 793 had a similar impact on the creation of an identity of England in English historiography. In Germany too, 10th century, the Ottonian dynasty found the pagan Magyars a very useful enemy. The existentialist threat to the Viking invasions destroyed the old English kingdoms, except for Wessex, and ended centuries of the balance of power in Britain. So in summary, in short, no Guthrum, no Alfred, and we may say no Alfred, no England. Thank you very much. I'll finish there.